I sat alone at a table set for four in one of the nicest restaurants in Toronto's Distillery District, watching the tea lights flicker inside empty wine glasses that had been polished to perfection for guests who were never coming. My husband had promised me he'd be there by 7. My best friend had confirmed our plans 3 times this week. My in-laws had been talking about this dinner for a month. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of anniversaries, of small traditions built into something I thought was permanent. And yet there I was, checking the door every time it opened, smoothing the tablecloth with hands that couldn't stop moving, smiling at the server with the kind of practiced calm that takes years of pretending to master. What I didn't tell any of them was that I already knew. I just needed to see how far they were willing to go. 3 hours earlier, I'd been sitting in the parking garage of our condo building in King West, engine off, staring at a photo on my phone that I hadn't asked for and couldn't unsee. My mother's gold locket, the one she'd pressed into my hands on my wedding day with tears running down her face. The one I'd reported missing to our building management 2 weeks ago. The one my husband had helped me search every drawer and shelf and coat pocket to find. That locket was around my best friend's neck in a photo taken 4 days ago. Inside a hotel lobby I recognized immediately because my husband had his arm around her waist and they were checking in together. The photo had come from a number I didn't recognize. No message. Just the image. I'd sat in that parking garage for 11 minutes. Then I'd driven to the restaurant, handed my coat to the hostess, and asked for our table. The restaurant had that particular kind of warmth that Toronto restaurants do well in November, when the cold outside makes the candlelight inside feel like something precious. The stone walls of the old Victorian building had been restored carefully, and the kitchen smelled of braised short rib and roasted garlic. On any other night I would have loved it here. My mother-in-law had chosen this place specifically because she remembered I'd mentioned it once, 2 Christmases ago. That detail alone told me everything I needed to know about who in my life had been paying attention. By 7:15, I ordered sparkling water. By 7:30, the server brought bread without being asked, his movements quiet and deliberate, the way experienced servers move when they're trying not to draw attention to a situation that's already drawing attention. His name tag said Marcus. He'd worked this section for the evening, and this was not the first time in his career he'd watched someone sit alone at a table meant for more people than arrived. He refilled my water and asked if I'd like to start with something while I waited. His tone was careful, professional, carrying none of the pity that the hostess near the front couldn't quite hide every time she glanced my way. I told him they were just running late. The words felt hollow even as I said them, the way certain sentences do when you've already stopped believing them yourself. My phone had been vibrating on and off since 6:30, but not with the names I'd expected. Promotional emails from a department store. A message from my dentist confirming an appointment. A text from my younger sister asking how the anniversary dinner was going, followed by a string of heart emojis that made my chest ache in a way I hadn't been prepared for. I typed back that it was lovely and put the phone face down. At 7:40, I called my mother-in-law. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the television in the background, the particular sound of the news program my father-in-law watched every evening without fail. When I told her I was at the restaurant, that I was still waiting, the line went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with bad reception. She spoke slowly, carefully, the way she speaks when she's trying to hold something together while she processes it. She said my husband had called them yesterday afternoon and explained that I hadn't been feeling well this week, that I was exhausted and overwhelmed and had decided to cancel the dinner because I needed a quiet evening at home. She said he'd told them I'd been struggling lately with anxiety, that I'd been having a hard time with things feeling real, that they should give me space and not check in too often because it would only make it worse. I pressed my phone against my ear and stared at the empty chair across from me. He hadn't just lied about the dinner. He'd started building a story about my mental state. He'd been planting seeds with the people who mattered most to me, framing my potential future accusations as symptoms before I'd even made them. It was the kind of manipulation that takes planning, patience, a complete absence of conscience. I told my mother-in-law that I was fine, that I was more than fine, that I would explain everything very soon. She said she and my father-in-law would get in the car right now if I needed them to. I told her to stay home, that tonight wasn't the night for that conversation but tomorrow would be. After I hung up, Marcus appeared at my elbow without making a sound. He set down a glass of Niagara Chardonnay I hadn't ordered. and with it, a small folded piece of paper that he placed beside my bread plate with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment. His eyes met mine briefly, just long enough to communicate something that wasn't part of his job description. Then he stepped back and returned to the service station near the kitchen. I unfolded the paper slowly. There were 2 lines in neat handwriting. The first said, "I think you should check your email." The second said, "I'm sorry this is happening to you. You were kind to my sister when you didn't have to be." I opened my email on my phone with hands that had gone very still. The message had arrived at 6:58, just before I'd sat down. It was from Marcus's personal address, and it contained 4 photographs and a link to a shared folder with a file name that was just a date and timestamp. The first photograph was the same one I'd already seen. My mother's locket around my best friend's neck in the lobby of the Marriott on Front Street. The second was taken inside the hotel restaurant. My husband and my best friend at a corner table, her left hand resting on top of his. The locket catching the light from the window behind them. The third was a screenshot of a text conversation. My best friend's name at the top. The messages were brief and unhesitating. One from her said, "She actually thinks she misplaced it. I've been wearing it to work." My husband's response, classic. "She notices nothing." Another from her, "What time tomorrow?" Followed by his, "After her yoga class, she'll be gone 2 hours, easy." The fourth photograph was a receipt. Room 412. 2 nights. Paid with the joint Visa card I hadn't checked in 3 months because my husband had taken over managing our accounts 18 months ago, telling me it would simplify things, telling me I already had enough on my plate with my job, telling me he wanted to help carry the load. I sat with those 4 images for a long time. Long enough for the couple at the table beside me to finish their entrees and move on to dessert. Long enough for the tea light inside the wine glass, across from me to burn down visibly. Long enough for the initial shock to become something quieter and more useful. I thought about how Marcus knew to contact me. It came back to me slowly. 2 years ago, his younger sister had applied for a junior account manager position at the communications firm where I worked as a director. She was a strong candidate but hadn't worked in the industry before, and HR had flagged her application as a long shot. I'd looked at her portfolio myself and pushed for her to get an interview. She'd been with us for 18 months now and was excellent at her job. I'd forgotten about it almost entirely because it hadn't felt like a significant thing to me. Apparently, it had felt significant to Marcus. He'd been our server on other occasions, I realized. He recognized my husband. He'd been watching something unfold over multiple visits and had been trying to figure out what to do about it. My kindness to his sister had tipped the balance. I flagged him down when he passed my table. He stopped, and I asked him quietly how long he'd been watching this situation develop. He told me he'd seen my husband and my best friend at the restaurant 3 times over the past 6 weeks. Always weeknights, always the corner table, always when I clearly wasn't expected. He said the 3rd time, he'd noticed the locket. He knew it was mine because he'd seen me wearing it on a previous anniversary dinner with my husband, almost 2 years ago, when everything had presumably been different. He said he hadn't known what to do with what he was seeing. He'd taken the photos with his phone because something told him documentation mattered. He'd pulled the receipt information from the system because he had access for billing purposes and it confirmed what the photos suggested. He'd held on to everything for 2 weeks trying to decide if it was his place to say anything. Then he'd seen my reservation on the system for tonight. Table for 4. Anniversary dinner. And he'd made his decision. I told him I was grateful in a way I didn't have adequate language for. He said he hoped I had people in my corner. I told him I was about to find out. I paid for my sparkling water and the wine I'd barely touched, left a tip that I hoped communicated something I couldn't say out loud, and walked out into the November air on King Street. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and clarifying the way Toronto winters always are, stripping away anything soft or unnecessary. I stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant and forwarded everything Marcus had sent me to an email address I created on my phone right there on the spot, then sent it to 3 more places for redundancy, because I'd read enough about people in situations like mine to know that evidence has a way of disappearing when the wrong people realize it exists. Then I sent my husband a text. Just 4 words. I hope it was worth it. I watched the message deliver. Then I watched the 3 dots appear immediately. Then I turned my phone off and walked to my car. I drove to my in-laws' house in Etobicoke. It was a 40-minute drive I'd made dozens of times, down the 427 and through the residential streets I knew well enough to navigate without GPS. My father-in-law answered the door in his housecoat looking startled and concerned. My mother-in-law was behind him with her reading glasses still on, a paperback still open in her hand. They looked at my face and they let me in without asking any questions, because they have always been the kind of people who understand that sometimes the questions can wait. We sat at their kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten Christmas dinner for 15 years, where my mother-in-law had taught me to make her pierogies, where my father-in-law had shaken my hand the first time I'd met him and told me his son was lucky. I set my phone between us and I walked them through what I'd received. My mother-in-law recognized the locket immediately. She'd seen it at our wedding. She'd known it came from my mother. She pressed one hand over her mouth and the other reached across the table and covered mine, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. My father-in-law's face went through several things in quick succession. Disbelief, recognition, grief, and then something that settled into quiet fury. The contained kind that in some ways is more frightening than the loud kind. He'd spent 38 years building a marriage based on exactly the values that his son had just incinerated. You could see him calculating what that meant. He asked me what I needed from them. I said I needed them to know the truth before the other version of it reached them, because another version was definitely coming. He nodded once and said, "We already know whose version we trust." I drove home afterward and let myself into the condo we'd shared for 11 years. My husband wasn't there. I hadn't expected him to be. I went into the bedroom and I opened the closet on his side and I looked at his things for a long time. The suits bought on Bloor Street. The running shoes lined up in 2 neat rows. The shelf of finance books he'd arranged by spine color. All of it so ordinary. All of it so completely separate now from anything that felt like it belonged to me. I made tea. I sat at our kitchen island with my laptop and I logged into our joint RBC account for the first time in 4 months, using the password I'd never actually forgotten even though I'd let him believe I had. I'd kept it written in a notebook inside a box of winter sweaters at the back of my closet, because I grew up watching my mother manage things alone after my father left, and some habits form early and don't let go. The account history stretched back across 18 months of choices I hadn't consented to, hotel charges I hadn't been told about, dinners for 2 at restaurants I'd never been taken to, an Air Canada booking for 2 seats to Vancouver in February, a long weekend I hadn't been invited to attend. He'd been meticulous about keeping the amounts below what I might notice if I'd been paying attention, which was its own kind of insult, the assumption that my threshold for noticing could be calculated and managed. I forwarded everything to a second email account and then I called the bank to report the card stolen. The customer service representative was polite and efficient in the way Canadians are trained to be, and the card was cancelled within 4 minutes. I sat for a moment after hanging up and thought about my husband trying to use it sometime in the next 12 hours. And I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. I turned my phone back on. 71 missed calls, 43 text messages, 11 voicemails. My husband's name appearing so many times across the screen that it had stopped looking like anything meaningful. My best friend had also called, 8 times, which told me they were together and she was aware the situation had changed. I didn't listen to anything. I opened our family WhatsApp group instead, the one with my in-laws and 2 of my husband's cousins and his aunt from Hamilton who sent everyone birthday messages in all caps and Easter stickers every spring. I selected the clearest of Marcus's photographs, the one at the restaurant table with her hand on his and the locket visible, and I sent it without any caption. Then I blocked both my husband and my best friend on every platform I could think of and I went to bed. He came home at 2 in the morning. I heard his key in the lock and his footsteps in the hallway and the long pause outside our bedroom door. I didn't move. I lay in the dark and I breathed steadily and I listened to him come to terms with the fact that the door was unlocked and his name was not on the family WhatsApp group and the credit card wasn't working and none of the calls had been answered. In the morning I was already dressed and sitting at the kitchen island with coffee when he walked in. He looked like someone who hadn't slept, which was accurate. He looked like someone who had spent the night trying to reverse something that couldn't be reversed, which was also accurate. He started with the approach he always used when he needed to regain ground. Calm, measured, the voice he used in meetings when he wanted to appear reasonable while steering things in the direction he'd already decided on. He said there was context. He said things had been complicated. He said I didn't understand the full picture. I slid my laptop across the counter and showed him the RBC account history. The measured tone lasted about 30 more seconds. He tried several different versions of the next hour. He tried explaining that it was a temporary situation and he'd been intending to tell me. He tried suggesting that the distance in our marriage had pushed him toward this, which required me to be partially responsible for his choices, an argument that would have worked on me 3 years ago and didn't work on me now. He tried saying my best friend had pursued him relentlessly, which was possibly even true and also completely beside the point. He tried telling me that what I was doing, sharing that photo with his family, was vindictive and unfair, and not the person he knew me to be. I told him the person he knew me to be had left the building sometime around when he started telling his parents I was having a breakdown. He flinched at that. He hadn't expected me to know about the anxiety story. He'd expected that particular piece of groundwork to still be intact, which told me he hadn't entirely given up on a version of events in which I accepted some curated explanation and we moved forward from there. I told him to pack enough for 2 weeks. I told him our lawyer would be in touch. I told him that the locket needed to come back to me, and that if it didn't come back intact he would be hearing about it in the context of the rest of the financial documentation I'd already sent to a family law lawyer recommended by my mother-in-law's friend in Mississauga. He left 2 hours later with a hockey bag and his laptop and the expression of a man who had constructed a version of his life so carefully that he'd forgotten it was constructed. My best friend texted me from a number I hadn't blocked yet, asking if we could talk, saying she needed me to understand, saying that she'd never meant for any of this to happen and that our friendship meant everything to her. I stared at that message for a long time. 22 years, since the first week of university in a residence common room where we'd both arrived 20 minutes early for an orientation session neither of us wanted to attend. 2 decades of sharing everything, or what I'd believed was everything, only to discover that the sharing had been entirely one-directional for longer than I wanted to calculate. I wrote back one sentence. Return the locket, and we can talk. Nothing else until then. The locket arrived in a padded envelope through my building's mail slot 4 days later. No note. Just the locket, wrapped in tissue paper, the clasp intact, the small diamond catching the light when I unwrapped it in my kitchen at 7 in the morning with my mother-in-law sitting across from me drinking the coffee I'd made. She had come to help me sort through paperwork. That was what she said when she called to ask if she could come over, framing it practically the way she always does when what she means is that she doesn't want me to be alone in this apartment. My father-in-law had offered to come too, but she told him one of them should stay home in case any of his relatives called with questions about the WhatsApp photo, because somebody needed to answer those calls, and she trusted her husband to be measured about it while she came here to be less measured if necessary. I told her what my best friend had done. Not in sequence but all at once, the way you describe something when you've been waiting to say it to the right person. She listened without interrupting, which is a particular skill. And when I finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, I always felt she was more comfortable in your life than she deserved to be. I hadn't expected that. I asked her what she meant. She said she'd noticed for years that my best friend had a way of positioning herself at the center of my stories. That every conversation I'd relayed from the two of them seemed to involve my best friend redirecting focus back to herself, her opinions, her assessments of my marriage, her advice about things that weren't her business. She said she'd never said anything because it wasn't her place and I'd seemed happy. She said she was sorry she hadn't found a way to say something before now. I thought about that for a long time after she left. The family law consultation happened the following Tuesday at an office on Bay Street with floor-to-ceiling windows and a lawyer who had short silver hair and the particular kind of composure that comes from having watched many people's marriages dissolve and remained convinced that getting through it is possible. She reviewed what I'd brought her. The account history, the hotel receipts, the photographs, the screenshot of the text messages, the documentation Marcus had provided. She made notes without reacting, and when she'd finished reviewing, she looked up and said the financial documentation was significant and that Ontario family law treats matrimonial property in a way that would work in my favor. She also said, your witness has excellent instincts. Whatever he's doing, he should keep doing it. Marcus had agreed to provide a written statement about what he'd observed. He'd also agreed to be reachable if anything went to formal proceedings, which the lawyer said was unlikely given how clearly the financial record spoke for itself. I'd gone to the restaurant to thank him properly, and he'd been matter-of-fact about it in the way that certain people are when they've done something decent and don't need it to be a bigger moment than it already was. He asked how I was holding up. I told him I was holding up better than I'd expected. He said that was usually how it went, in his experience, with people who had enough self-respect to tell the truth. My best friend called twice more in the 2 weeks following. The second time I answered. She said everything I'd expected her to say, the words arranged in the order people arrange them when they've rehearsed the conversation and convinced themselves that enough sincerity in the delivery can substitute for actual accountability. She said she loved me. She said she'd made a catastrophic mistake. She said she had been in a terrible place in her own life and had made choices she couldn't justify. She said she needed me to know that what we had was real, our friendship, and that she didn't want to lose it. I told her that what we had was real. I told her that was exactly why I wouldn't be able to forget that she'd looked me in the face while wearing my dead mother's locket and said nothing. I told her that I hoped she built a life she was proud of, and that I wished her no particular harm, and that I wasn't going to be part of whatever came next for her. She started crying. I waited until she'd finished and then I said goodbye and I meant it as a final thing and I hung up. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't look like grief from the outside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require witnesses. It moves through you in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when the rest of the world is asleep and you are lying in an apartment that still has 2 sets of coffee cups and half a kitchen organized around someone else's preferences. I felt it most in those hours quietly, without drama, and by morning it had usually settled back into something manageable. I repainted the bedroom. I moved my desk from the small second room I'd been using into the living room where the light was better. I put my mother's locket in my jewelry box and for several weeks I didn't touch it, and then one morning I put it on and went to work and it felt like the right thing to do and I haven't stopped wearing it since. My mother-in-law brought dinner to my apartment on a Sunday in December, a week before the divorce paperwork was signed. She brought pierogies, the ones from her recipe, the ones I'd been learning to make for 8 years and still hadn't perfected. She set everything out on my kitchen counter, and we ate standing up because the table was covered in documents I hadn't moved yet, and it didn't feel like a problem. Standing there eating dinner in the kitchen on a Sunday in December with someone who had chosen me even after her son had made it complicated. My father-in-law sent me a text that evening while she was still there. It said, "You were never the problem. You were always the solution he didn't deserve." I kept that text. I have it still, saved in a folder on my phone with a few other things I don't want to lose track of. The locket is back where it belongs. The account is in my name alone, at a different bank, because sometimes starting somewhere new is easier than cleaning up what was there before. The apartment is mine for now, and when I'm ready, it will become something else too. There is a clarity in the aftermath of betrayal that people who haven't been through it tend to underestimate. The uncertainty that came before, the suspicion I kept talking myself out of, the mornings I woke up feeling that something was wrong and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was imagining things that weight is gone. In its place is something I didn't know I was missing. I wrote about it, eventually. Not the specific details, but the shape of it, the way it felt to sit at a table for 4 in a restaurant in the distillery district and understand, slowly and then all at once, that the life I thought I had was a version of the life someone else was living at my expense. I submitted it to a Canadian women's publication, and they ran it in February, and the response was larger than I'd anticipated. Messages from women I'd never met who recognized something specific in what I'd described, the particular experience of being gaslit by the people closest to you until you start to believe the distorted version of yourself they've been constructing. I wrote back to as many of them as I could. I told each of them the same thing: the clarity you're looking for already exists inside you. You just need to stop letting other people tell you it doesn't. Marcus sent me a text when the article was published. He'd read it online. It said, "I'm glad you're okay. My sister told me to say hi." I laughed for the first time in a while when I read that. The real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine and catches you slightly off guard. I saved that text too in the same folder next to my father-in-law's message, next to a photo of me and my mother-in-law eating pierogies standing up in my kitchen in December. Neither of us looking like someone who has just survived something, which is maybe the most accurate way of capturing what survival actually looks like. They thought I was sitting alone at that table because I had no one. They had the equation exactly backwards. I was sitting alone at that table because the people who were supposed to be there had already told me, without saying a word, everything I needed to know about who they actually were. The table for 4 was full. I just hadn't met all the guests yet. And trust me, the people who showed up were worth every empty chair.